Elizabeth Taylor, co-author of American Pharaoh, Mayor Richard Daley, his battle for Chicago and the nation. Where'd you get the title?
Daley was a pharaoh in many senses of the word. He was powerful, he was autocratic, he ruled Chicago for 21 years from 1955 until his death in 1976. And another way, he was also a builder. He built all of the great things with which we associate Chicago. The world's busiest airport, the world's tallest building, Sears Tower, the beautiful, magnificent Mile, the skyline, it's all his. He also built some of the worst buildings in Chicago, some of the public housing projects. And finally, the word pharaoh, it was his nickname from civil rights leaders who had dubbed him that in the 50s and 60s because of his resistance to civil rights, particularly his resistance to Martin Luther King, who actually moved to Chicago and lived there for 8 months.
There's a picture in here, and people who remember the 1968 convention might remember this shot of him at the microphone. What is that?
That is Daley defending his city. Senator Abraham Ribicoff had just said, you know, if we elect McGovern, we will not have the Gestapo tactics in Chicago. He was referring to the extraordinary protests that were occurring on the streets of Chicago, and this was sort of Daley's lowest moment.
Why low?
Daley had campaigned hard. He had wanted the convention brought to Chicago so he could showcase this beautiful city that he had rescued from the brink of despair. And he left no detail untouched. He looked at the convention hall and focused on everything from the ashtrays to the banners, simply every detail. And he was extremely worried about the violence. This was in the aftermath of the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. He did not want anything upsetting his city. And the protesters had their sights on Chicago, and he was determined not to let them get any attention. They approached him consistently for all sorts of permits, and he denied them those permits, and this wrangling went on for months. Meanwhile, Daley was sort of, you know, dressing up the city and making it look really beautiful. But finally, in this terrible 20 minutes, everything exploded. The police went wild, attacking protesters, and protesters were also violent. Daley just didn't know what to make of it. Here were these, you know, people who nominated Pegasus, this 125-pound pig, for president. They'd threatened to poison the water. They had said that they were going to pull down Hubert Humphrey's pants on stage. These were totally, you know, things that he couldn't deal with. He didn't understand sort of the idealism of the protesters. He kept saying, well, what do they want? What programs do they want? But in the end, Daley was really underestimated, and he came out of it kind of brilliantly.
What part of the country did you grow up in?
I grew up in Swarthmore, a suburb of Philadelphia.
How long have you lived in Chicago?
I was transferred to Chicago by Time magazine. I was a correspondent there, first based in New York. I began in 1983, and then on to Chicago in 1984. And I worked at the magazine until 1996.
Now, Mayor Daley died in '76, as you say, so you never lived under him?
Never, never. The 1968 convention was really sort of my first memory as a child of Daley.
Richard M. Daley is who? Who is he?
He is Richard J. Daley's eldest son, and like in all good family businesses, he went on to run the family business, and he is now mayor of Chicago.
How long has he been mayor?
He has been mayor since Harold Washington was the first, was elected mayor in 1983, then reelected in 1987. He died in office, and then Richard M. Daley came in shortly thereafter in '89.
What kind of a mayor has he been compared to his father?
He's very much like his father, but sort of in miniature. Richard J. Daley, operated this huge machine of patronage, 40,000 jobs, and the current mayor is sort of making the widgets in the factory that his father built. They both understand, and this is actually something that Dan Rostenkowski told us in an interview, something that his father had told Richard J. Daley: show people where you're putting their money. Richard J. Daley did that in beautifying Chicago, and Richard M. Daley has done the same. And while Richard J. Daley built big expressways and big buildings, Richard M. Daley is building cul-de-sacs and wrought iron fences. Everything's on a much smaller scale.
And who is the Secretary of Commerce as he relates to the family?
That's William Daley, and he was actually our kind of window into the Daley family. He's widely recognized in Chicago and around the country as a smart guy, and sat down and I interviewed him several times, and he gave us this perspective of the family.
Now, has a book like this ever been done?
No, there's been a wonderful, rich literature on Chicago. The most famous book is, of course, Mike Royko's Boss, published in 1970. It was very journalistic and kind of gave a great sense of the times, but it was largely anecdotal and just a really fun book to read, and it's a good companion to our book. Another author who's is really terrific, has contributed to the works on Chicago, is Milton Rakove. I think actually his son is a scholar who's been on your program before. Yeah.
So in 1968, you had the convention, and then when you read about the Chicago 8, David Dellinger and Rennie Davis and all these people, you also see the name Bobby Rush eventually later on after that, and Bobby Rush is now a congressman.
Right.
How does he fit into all this? Was he a Daley supporter?
No, actually, he ran a terrible race most recently for mayor. He's currently a congressman. He, like many, has sort of softened over time, but is still an opponent of Daley's. The story of the black submachine in Chicago is really fascinating.
And that's, by the way, a phrase you use throughout the book, black submachine.
Right. I mean, Daley operated the machine, and he really depended on sort of loyal black voters, and they really stuck with him over time. And the first one was William Dawson, at one point the sort of most powerful black man in America, only congressman. He really supported Daley and was, in fact, opposed to integration. Kind of ironic because he had fled Georgia because of his family was threatened over a racial incident. But he continued to be a loyal soldier for Daley.
William Dawson.
William Dawson, and he was a very smart guy. We interviewed his nephew and some other relatives of his. We studied his papers at Fisk University. It's a fascinating character. Another character, the Black Submachine, who began as a sort of subservient follower and then became one of the harshest critics, was one of my personal favorites in the book. Was an Olympic star, Ralph Metcalfe, who was a congressman, and he broke with Daley over the issue of police brutality. It took him a while, and actually his son said, "Hey, Dad, it's, the mayor or me." Two dentists who had been injured by police in traffic violations. They were pulled over, and one, in fact, had a stroke in custody and was then killed. Daley refused to meet Metcalfe in his home district. refused to meet him on the South Side. And Metcalf was really upset. And Metcalf eventually just cut it off with Daley. He later said, "It's never too late to be black."
Now, on Bobby Rush's case, what I was getting at was the Fred Hampton raid. When did that happen? What was that about?
The Black Panthers in Chicago had really started to kind of get hold in 69 and 70. They had got a very good public relations campaign going. They had free lunch programs, free daycare, and it was they were really trying to kind of make an appeal and kind of position themselves as opponents to Daley. But in this horrible raid, it was ordered by Ed Hanrahan, who was a player in this later. Police went in and just started firing away, killing Hampton and Clark, and it was later learned that there were no arms in that apartment at all. And Daley, that started.
Was that ordered by Mayor Daley?
It was not clear that Daley himself was ordering it, but his people were very much behind it.
How many times did Richard J. Daley get elected mayor?
He was elected 1955, 1959, 63, 67, 71, and again in 1975.
Did he ever come close to losing?
No. Even in his last election, when was a terrifically strong independent running against him, Bill Singer, in 1975, there was a black candidate, Richard Newhouse, and Ed Hanrahan, who'd been involved in the Black Panthers. Daley was in the primary. Daley still won handily.
Was he an honest man?
There was a point where his floor leader, Tom Keene, who actually ended up going to jail, in which he's a wonderful story, he said that he wanted money and Daley wanted power. He was honest. He tolerated corruption around him, but he wasn't about money. He was about power. And James Thompson, later governor of Illinois, at that point U.S. attorney, really gunned for Daley and put a lot of his closest cronies in jail. And I believe if there had been anything real there, Jim Thompson would have gotten it.
Where did Mayor Daley live?
He lived his whole life in Bridgeport, and it's a totally fascinating place. It's a neighborhood in Chicago, and it's sort of an Irish Catholic sort of enclave. The neighborhoods in Chicago are very strong, stronger than in any city I've ever lived. And we title our chapter A Separate World, and it really was a separate world. He lived on Low Street his whole life, sort of always within a block from his mother. He went to church just a block or two away. He grew up in the shadow of the stockyards, and it was just a really violent place. Upton Sinclair wrote about it in The Jungle, and Daley actually worked in the stockyards a little bit. In one of his campaigns, he showed himself as a kind of riding around and working in the stockyards.
How many children did he have?
He had 7 children.
We talked about Richie Daley, the mayor currently of Chicago, and Bill Daley, the Secretary of Commerce. What did the other 5 do?
The other 5 are teachers. One was a nun. They're not a sort of a Kennedy-like family. Everybody going into politics.
Would they talk to you?
Bill was our contact, and Bill was very helpful, and he gave us a lot of names to contact, and we spoke with all those people. And then at a point, there's a documentary that came out a couple of years ago that was very critical of Daley, and the family did not like it. And at that point, he said, "We really can't cooperate anymore." And so that was it.
So, did they think that this? Well, let me just re-ask it. What do they think of this book? Do you have any idea?
I have no idea. And we've heard a few things through the grapevine, but it's been praised by a lot of reviewers like David Bedore as being really balanced, and that's what we were really trying to do. I think people thought, gosh, who are these two young kids from not Chicago, coming in here doing this book? And it was because we were just so totally fascinated by this story. We just loved it, and it was just a great way to talk about America.
Who's your co-author, Adam Cohen?
My co-author is my best friend, Adam Cohen. He and I actually were interns together at Time magazine in 1983, and I continued at Time, and he proceeded, finishing his last year at Harvard College and then going to Harvard Law School, where he was president of the Law Review. And I had just left graduate school at Yale in American history, and we continued our sort of friendship and talk about the subject, and then we just decided we had to do this book.
And where is he today?
He now works in New York as a senior writer for Time magazine.
And how did you divide up the responsibilities?
Well, it's been so long. We worked on this book. We had got the contract 7 years ago, but we actually got the idea like 10 years ago and wrote about a 100-page proposal. And I was in Chicago, so I did a lot of the initial reporting, and Adam did a lot of the kind of research in other parts of the country, for instance, going to look at Dawson's papers. And he started writing from the front, and I started writing from the back. We met up in the middle. But I did a lot of interviewing. And our first thought was to talk to people who were very old to make sure that we didn't lose them.
Like, who would be in that category?
A lot of people, but one was somebody we did lose, was this wonderful judge, federal judge, Hubert Will, who was a reformer, and he had actually helped Daley get elected in 1955, and kind of an unlikely ally of Daley's, and then told us how he had tried to get Daley to sort of moderate his views on the protesters, and in 1968 he died shortly after we talked to him. One of my saddest ones was Tom Keene, who everybody says was this totally brilliant guy, floor leader, and
floor leader where? Floor
leader in the city council. Just a very charming. But I was shocked that he agreed to talk to us. I talked to him on the phone several times, and it was just, people always said, he'll never talk to you. But I just called him up, like we did with everybody. And he was wonderful on the phone. And in fact, he said, we were going to meet on April 15th. And he said, don't you get it? I said, what do you mean? He goes, it's my favorite day, tax day. He had gone to jail for tax evasion. So then his wife called several days before the interview and said that he was in the hospital, and then he later died. And I sort of whistled that I hadn't set the interview up a little earlier.
Now, why was he a good story?
He knew, he was one of the people who was sort of closest to Daley, and he was kind of irreverent. He would just say whatever was on his mind. And when Martin Luther King came to Chicago, and which is a great story and a kind of key element of the book, there was a summit meeting that Daley had held, and Daley had brought after King had lived in Chicago for 8 months, Daley and some realtors and some legislators all sat down and had a summit agreement where they sort of agreed on open housing. And then King got on a plane, went down, back to Alabama, and Keene said, "What agreement? We never had an agreement." He was a really wily guy, and he helped Daley out a lot.
What do you think, from what you could tell, Mayor Daley thought of blacks?
Daley, it traces back to to Bridgeport, and there was just really.
And by the way, where is Bridgeport?
Bridgeport is sort of, it's on this sort of, it's right, for sports fans, it's right near Comiskey Park where the White Sox play, and Daley went to Comiskey Park all the time. He was a big baseball fan. It's south of the Loop and slightly east. Bridgeport was this little enclave, and there were no blacks there. And in fact, in 1961, as an example of sort of the feelings of his community, and there's this fire on the Douglas Hotel on the south side, and many blacks were homeless as a result of it. They were, the Red Cross came in and tried to give them temporary housing in a church in Bridgeport, but residents were furious and, jeered and said, get the Negroes out, and they were swiftly removed. And this was as Freedom Riders were sort of traveling the country and gaining some success. So he was not comfortable with blacks, and he really saw himself as sort of as being Irish and one of the out groups, and he just thought that blacks should, pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
But there was, for somebody who's never been to Chicago, and you point out in the book that back in the early 1900s it had 3 million people there. How many does it have today?
Like about well, there's a huge controversy about the census right now, so nobody exactly knows. But it's the third largest city. It's like.
But it's under 3 million.
Oh yeah, way under.
What happened? Where'd they all go?
Daley actually held on to a lot of white people fleeing to the suburbs. He did a much better job of that than, say, Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis. One of the brilliant ideas he had was that, for instance, if you worked for the city, you had to live in the city. That really was pretty effective. And he also made it the Loop and a thriving place, kept a lot of industry in Chicago when it could have left. And we give him a lot of credit for saving Chicago. You
have a map here in the front of the book. It's hard to see the detail on it, but what's the purpose of putting that in there?
Chicago is really a city sort of defined by its architecture, and Daley had a big role in kind of placing all those buildings where they are, everything from O'Hare to the public housing projects, which, as a reporter, I started to cover for Time magazine, and the conventional wisdom was, oh, they've always been there, who knows how they got there, Daley inherited them. And we really started to think, gosh, let's figure out how did they get there. Demographers call Chicago hyper-segregated. They talk about the sort of the spatial mismatch between jobs and residents where people live. And this is, we trace this back to Daley and the fact that of those 4 census tracts, most of them are in Chicago housing projects.
And how big is the African-American population in Chicago?
It's not a majority, but it's close. It's like over 40%. And then there's Hispanic population that sort of goes either way.
And from what you could tell from your research, how did public housing work out in Chicago? And what is it?
Public housing. Well, when we talk about public housing, there are these. Robert Taylor Homes is one of the most famous public housing projects in the country. And it's miles and miles of tall buildings, tall brick buildings, separated by one of the world's widest highway. And
the Dan Ryan?
The Dan Ryan, exactly. And that's on the map. And then Bridgeport is on the other side. So that highway separates these housing projects from Bridgeport.
How many lanes is the Dan Ryan Expressway?
Oh, it's 14.
14 lanes?
Yeah.
Does it go right by the city?
Right. Yeah, you take the Dan Ryan all the time.
So Chicago sits on Lake Michigan with under 3 million people.
Right.
And this highway, and then did Mayor Daley build this highway?
Yeah, he placed it, rooted it there.
Why?
and to divide as a dividing line. I mean, we needed a highway because there were all these people going, but it could have gone on a lot of different routes. And traffic experts that we interviewed and talked with said that it could have gone in different places, but it went there to sort of to really bisect the city. And the public housing projects were Daley's effort. They were described as sort of human filing cabinets into the sky.
And who could live there?
Well, at the beginning, they were envisioned as sort of way stations for the poor, public housing. There's this wonderful woman who we hope we've given life to in the book. There's so many great sub-characters. Elizabeth Wood, this poetry professor from Vassar, who was the first head of the Chicago Housing Authority. And she was for sort of low-rise, integrated public housing.
Just go back to the 30s?
40s.
40s, what year was she?
And then she was, in the 40s, and then she was sort of kicked out in 1954 when Daley was really head of the machine, and which is a very powerful job, which he promised to give up when he was made mayor, but he never did. And Elizabeth Wood also got herself into some trouble because she was resisting these high-rises. Also, she resisted the appointment of one of Daley's relatives to the staff of the CHA. She said that they shouldn't hire somebody who had finished last in his law school class. Anyway, but these housing projects were very important for several reasons, and Daley wasn't the only one who wanted them. I mean, the Black Submachine was really for them too, because they were a way to consolidate votes. It was very easy for a precinct captain to kind of march up the towers and down, and there was so much dependency. People could, felt that they would have to vote the machine ticket, or they'd be thrown out of their apartments.
You use an audio tape that we run on our radio stations all the time of the president talking, the Oval Office conversation of LBJ, where this whole thing about precincts comes up, and you quote Mayor Daley talking to LBJ about precinct captains. What's the scenario on that, and why were precinct captains important?
Oh, precinct captains were so important. In fact, there's an anecdote in the book that Daley says, this guy has a great education, he's a great lawyer, he's a great American, and best of all, he's a precinct captain.
Talking to LBJ.
Right, it was the highest calling. And the precinct captain was the guy, and usually was a guy, who got out the votes. And if
did he buy them?
Sometimes there were lots of different ways. There was something called four-legged voting, where the precinct captain would literally walk into the voting booth with a voter and help them pull down the lever. A reporter who covered elections told us he saw one precinct captain pull down the lever 70 times at the start of the day. They would go into flop houses and get the names of the winos and kind of register them as voters. They would offer them everything from nylons to Christmas trees to eyeglasses to get them to vote. And they really worked hard, and if they didn't turn out the vote, they were, as it was called, viced. That meant that they lost their paycheck, their job, and it was a real problem.
Mayor Richard J. Daley, 21 years as mayor,
Yeah.
1955 to 1976.
Right.
Some names in your book that people hear all the time. Where did the name O'Hare come from? And I know it's often the biggest. Some days it's Atlanta that's the biggest airport. You get them back and forth, but where'd that all come from?
There was a politician. It was named for an old Irish politician, but in fact Daley didn't really call it O'Hare, even though it's spelled O'Hare and said O'Hare. He always mangled names, and he called it O'Hara Airport. And
did he build it? Was that his idea?
Yeah, it was his idea to really build it up and to make sure that the city owned it. But it's, as you can see on the map, there's a very long little strip, so that it's
to the airport.
Technically in Chicago.
Is it in Chicago?
It isn't, yeah.
But it's really in the suburbs.
Right.
Where did the name Dan Ryan come from?
Dan Ryan had been another big Irish political boss in Chicago, who had been like head of the county board.
Another name that factors in is Otto Kerner. We know him from the Otto Kerner, the Kerner Commission. What was that?
The Kerner Commission was known, for its deliberations and consideration of discrimination, and it really called for sort of the separate black, the problem with the separate black and white America. But Kerner had been governor of Illinois, and he had been an ally of Daley's, and he also went to jail.
Why?
For, I think the reason he went to jail, I think, was the racetrack stock. He has taken it and not paid taxes on it, and he had.
When in the sequence after the Kerner Commission was issued, do you remember what year it was issued? And it was ordered up by Lyndon Johnson.
Right, I want to say like 64.
And
yeah.
And he went to jail after that?
Yeah, after that. He's part of the kind of the James Thompson kind of, who was the Republican U.S. attorney, sort of effort to kind of put the machine officials in jail.
James Thompson, you mentioned a couple times. How many people surrounding Richard J. Daley did he put in jail?
A lot. I mean, there were some of the biggies were Otto Kerner, Keene, who was Daley's floor leader, Paul Wagoda, who was a city councilman and a Daley ally. He also put Earl Bush, who was Daley's speechwriter and was sort of known as sort of the intellectual on the staff. He's the only Jewish person on Daley's staff.
Why'd he go to jail?
He had gone to jail. He actually may not actually, he was convicted, but he may not actually serve time. There's another agreement worked out, but he was definitely convicted. He had gotten involved in selling or being on a company that sold airport signs. I mean, it was really like Mickey Mouse stuff. He just, couldn't believe, but he was benefiting from the airports.
What happened to Jim Thompson after he put all these people in jail?
Got elected governor.
For how long?
He was elected, I think it was 4 times.
Was he successful? Was he always seen to be honest in this process?
He was, but he was also seen as sort of somebody who he was politically ambitious and wanted to be governor. And he, in fact, some people thought that he could be a presidential candidate. And
what's he doing today?
He's a lawyer and I guess and an avid antique collector.
Now, another name that comes up that we hear a lot about in history is Anton Cermak. Early on in your book, you talk about, I guess he was called Tony Cermak by somebody. I always hear it. Who was he?
Cermak was, there's a big Cermak Road. Cermak was a major, he was somebody who kind of was, helped build the machine. He figured out sort of the ethnic politics of, how you set up Chicago as a machine and play different ethnic groups off one another.
And how early in the century was he the mayor?
The turn of the century, or just as Daley.
Was he mayor? Was he mayor when he was killed in 1933?
Yes.
And how did that happen?
The famous, it could have been Franklin Roosevelt or Cermak. I was, aiming for Roosevelt, and Cermak was in the way. He had a pretty
Miami
large,
Beach.
Miami. It's pretty large, so it'd be easy for him to get in the way.
Was he killed instantly? Do you remember?
I think on the way to the hospital. I think.
But why was Anton Cermak the mayor of Chicago and FDR together in Miami Beach? Do you remember?
It was FDR had just been elected, and Cermak was, on a fishing trip, and I think that he had kind of elbowed his way into things.
And he was a Czech.
Yes.
How much did ethnic politics play in Mayor Daley's success?
He was brilliant at sort of playing ethnic politics, people off each other. It's also important to understand that even within, say, the Irish Chicago, it wasn't all sort of monolithic. I interviewed an alderman And I said, oh, you must have known Daley, you're from Bridgeport. And he said, oh, no, we were from different parishes. Even within the parishes, or even within certain neighborhoods, there were distinctions. North side Irish, south side Irish, that kind of thing.
What was Mayor Daley's wife like?
She seemed to be Sis Daley. She stood by him. She was very, baked soda bread every day. She's still alive. She still lives in the house on Low Street.
Same house?
Same house. And you can go by it. Sometimes when we felt that we had to get closer to the story, we would kind of go back to Low Street and just walk around and walk from Daley's house to Nativity Parish to the Hamburg Club.
In this picture that we were showing here on the screen just a moment ago, the kids, where in the picture is Bill Daley, the Secretary of Commerce? Can you see? Or where is the mayor?
The mayor is in the top right, and
right up here is Mayor Daley now today.
And
Bill Daley's back there.
Bill is the second.
He has no hair now, so it's hard to tell.
Right, it is.
I'll check
second
it.
One.
Public housing is a lot in your book, but also, you talk about the race problem in public housing throughout the book, but you also talk about the 1960 election. Did Mayor Daley, how do you ask this question, steal or buy or force votes for John F. Kennedy that helped him win the state of Illinois?
We think that he did.
How'd you go about researching?
But we think that there were so many votes stolen that it's probable that he got enough to win the election. We interviewed a lot, we read a lot, we interviewed a lot of people who were working in the election, including a son of a precinct captain who said that they got a knock late at night and said, we need 30 more votes from your precinct.
Let me give the numbers. I wrote them down so that everybody listening can know what we're talking about. In 1960, John Kennedy got 49.7% of the vote against Richard Nixon's 49.6. So we're talking about 0.1 difference. But you point out here that the electoral vote was 303 for John F. Kennedy and 219 for Richard Nixon.
Right.
So almost no matter what had happened in Illinois.
Right. Like Illinois or Texas.
Or Texas, which is also disputed.
Right.
But in Illinois, the popular vote was 8,858 more for John F. Kennedy than for Richard Nixon. So what else did you learn about this vote?
The vote theft was extraordinary. Just the four-legged voting, the bribing people, there was a guy named Short Pencil Lewis who was famous for erasing out names. In 1955, he erased out Kennelly and put in Daley on many different ballots. So this was widespread. It was sort of accepted that it was going to happen. Poll watchers, Republican poll watchers were sent home for threatened. They were really irrelevant. One thing that's totally interesting is that Daley, he felt affinity for John Kennedy. He had a long relationship with his father, Joe Kennedy, who the Kennedys owned the Merchandise Mart, this huge piece of real estate in Chicago. But Daley really cared about the state's attorney race, which was the state's attorney sort of was the local prosecutor. And he was determined that the Republican candidate, Benjamin Adamowski, would not be elected. Adamowski had been a friend of Daley's. He turned Republican and was just bashing the machine constantly. And Adamowski posed a threat to Daley. And many people believe, and I think this is right, that Daley worked very hard, not just for Kennedy, but against Adamowski.
How would they do it? First, did you find evidence that actual cash money was ever paid to anybody to vote?
People would tell us stories of, of paying people, but they would also just, for instance, go into a flop house and, because liquor stores were closed, those on election day and sort of, give booze to winos so that they would vote. There was, they would give, one woman said, "Oh, I can't vote for you," she said to a reform candidate, "because I get a Christmas tree from my precinct captain. He gives everyone a Christmas tree. You can't afford that." So it was a lot of sort of gifts in kind. There was a lot of that sort of thing going on.
You cited
and jobs.
a 1972 Chicago Tribune series on vote fraud, and you were working at the Chicago Tribune. How long have you been there?
I started at the Tribune in 1996, so can't say I was part of that.
What did you find in that 72 series of articles?
We interviewed some of the people who'd worked on those stories and the stories very carefully. It was really showed us how this election fraud happened, how elections were just really, election honesty was sort of totally flaunted. That the precinct records were erased and made up, and that precinct captains were threatening Republicans. It was not an honest, open system at all.
Talk about the reporter going to the McCoy Hotel, wherever that is, and then registering as James Joyce and Henry David Thoreau and all that, and no one ever caught him.
No, Bill Rechtenwald, a longtime reporter, and he also had worked for the Better Government Association. Yeah, he told us those tales. It was.
Is he still around?
Yes, he is.
What impact did that series have?
I think it's really started a reform movement, and it started people criticizing the machine. Later there was something known as the Shackman Decree that really started to dismantle patronage, which is a key part of the machine and how it operated.
Is patronage still around?
It was really eviscerated by the decree. The patronage essentially entailed sort of 40,000 jobs that would be at the disposal of the mayor, and he could dispense them as he liked, or he could punish people. A precinct captain, if they didn't deliver, take away their patronage jobs. And so it was pretty serious stuff.
But today, does Richard M. Daley have the patronage that his father had?
No. It's a shell of what it used to be.
Does the city run as well or better than it did back in those days? I mean, how's the city today?
The city is, and we owe Richard J. Daley a big credit for this. I mean, it's a thriving, wonderful city, and with a downtown that's bustling. People have stayed in the city; they haven't fled to the suburbs. But there are these lingering problems. Especially in the worst of these is public housing.
Well, if you look back at how the blacks voted, overwhelmingly for Richard J. Daley, didn't they?
Absolutely. Until like 1963, in fact, he lost the white vote to Benjamin Adamowski, a Polish candidate, and he won. He won because blacks supported him.
But if you were black and voted for him all those years, today, looking at the scene, did it pay off for you?
No. I mean,
Why'd they stay with him?
They stayed with him. First of all, there weren't a lot of good alternatives, and it took a long time for them to gradually resist, and for there to be sort of people like Ralph Metcalfe and others who would resist him.
What's the little story about Jesse Jackson and the job?
Oh, it's a great story. He went to Daley and wanted a job, and Daley said, "Well, you can be
What year?
operate a toll booth." I can't remember. It was like the early '60s, I think. He said, "I operate a toll booth."
And what was Jesse Jackson doing then?
It was before he started actively organizing Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. He was then he became part of the sort of civil rights movement, and it's one of the a lesser player, but still a player.
What were you surprised at in this after you finished all this research?
One of the things is that Adam and I were struck, we've known a lot about 1968, we've known a lot about public housing, and I think that we came out of it with really a very deep appreciation for what this guy went through. He did not change over time. He did not evolve. He was, in a sad way, sort of a dinosaur at the end. But he was a very determined. He made a life out of very little, and he really tried to save the city, and we want to give him credit for that.
Well, you know, in the reviews on your book, you get all kinds of comments made about, was he, I know the Wall Street Journal talked about, was he one of the top 5 mayors in history? Deal with that one. Do you think he was?
Well, it depends on how they mean top, but, you know, I mean, I lived in a city with Mayor Rizzo, so, you know, Philadelphia. He was definitely better than Mayor Rizzo. You know, I think John Lindsay was doing some pretty imaginative and interesting things that Daley wasn't doing. He was a really important and powerful leader.
What is your job now?
I now am the literary editor and magazine editor of the Chicago Tribune. So I edit the book review section and the magazine sections.
This was published by Little Brown.
Yeah.
Is it your first book?
Yes.
So what did you think of the experience after all these years of writing about others?
Oh, it's just absolutely fascinating. I mean, Little Brown sort of took us on when Adam and I were really kids, and before I knew anything about the book reviewing business. And it's fascinating. I actually, I thought I would be much more sort of worried about the reviews than I end up being, but now I feel like it's out there, and we kind of have confidence in the book, and we really feel privileged to get this great story.
But what about just from, you know, as the literary editor and you watch books come in, what did you learn about that process that is either surprising you or...
Several things. One is that there's so many books just never see the light of day. Serious books that really, that people should read. And we're so lucky that ours did. And you know, we worked really hard to write a sort of a serious book that was accessible and readable and had strong characters. But I'm also surprised and heartened by the fact that there really is an appetite for this kind of book, that people are buying it. And, you know, we go into stores and people say it's flying off the shelves, and, you know, I don't know what authors did before they could check their Amazon numbers, which is how it's selling on Amazon, but we check all the time, and it's doing well.
Do you know how many copies they printed for first printing, and is it still in the first printing?
I don't know. You know what? I actually have made it principle not to ask. I don't want to be disappointed or surprised.
614 pages. Now, it's a big book.
It was bigger before our editor started working on it.
But again, from sitting there at the desk watching all these books come through, did you think this was going to be okay, 614, or would you rather had it more or less?
Well, to tell you the truth, when we were writing it, we had no idea it was going to be 614 pages. We literally had no idea. I mean, we were just writing, and you know, we just knew that it was thousands of computer pages. You know, yeah, I guess shorter is better, more accessible, but then I think, what could we have taken out? Oh gosh, you know, Elizabeth Wood, no. Some details about the 1960 election, I can't part with any of them. In fact, I want to say more, not less.
Now, the Chicago Tribune comes up, the Chicago Sun-Times, there was the Chicago Daily News and all that, and the Chicago Today. What would be different in a city like Chicago if you didn't have the newspapers?
I really feel that a city really benefits from having these 4 different newspapers. There's also the Chicago Defender and the Chicago Daily American. And
Defender was the black newspaper.
Yeah, this is a subject for a whole other book. But these 4 newspapers would cover the same event entirely differently. Now, people quote this, news coverage quotes the same people, and it's the same kind of coverage. It's kind of been through the mix master. But this reporting and writing was totally different, and it was great to kind of, you had a much fuller understanding of what happened. I mean, in the riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King, they were covered totally different by all parts of all the papers.
In what way?
Oh, some would focus on sort of the political, what was going to happen in the larger political scheme, whether what that meant for the movement. Others were really local about different shops that were getting blasted. Others were focusing on sort of the federal government and what it was going to be doing and who was coming in. It was really, they're just very different approaches.
You get any sense of what politicians would be like in a place like Chicago if there weren't newspapers, though? I mean, you had the Jim Thompson, who was a U.S. attorney at the time, went after the Daley administration. You had the Chicago Tribune, all the other papers reporting on it. What would politicians do if these parts of the system weren't there, do you think? What are their instincts?
Yeah, I think that they sort of, a generation or two ago, sort of did more what they wanted. And now they really do have to be more sensitive to the media, and especially television. I mean, that's the real change. I mean, Daley met with newspaper reporters all the time, and he was mayor. And as over the years, with the increase of television and with his famous malaprops, he sort of avoided television more and more.
You say that his career turned on some this is your phrase, well-timed deaths.
Right.
Explain that.
He would, it's a point made by Benjamin Adamowski, who was his friend in the state legislature and then his rival, and he said he would attach himself to someone and then wait until they died and then step right over them. And one of his first patrons was a guy named Big Joe McDonough, this 250-pound alderman and active in the Hamburg Club, which was kind of the first rung in the Bridgeport political ladder. And he died, and Daley took his job. I mean, that happened a lot. What
were the different jobs that Mayor Daley had before he became mayor?
He was a state legislator. He was a county clerk. He was a state treasurer. He was a lot of different jobs. He was very good at detailed work. When he was county clerk, he did things like, you think, just what kind of job is that? And, give out marriage licenses. And he had the people giving the marriage licenses wear little suits, and he was, beautifying the licenses, and each one said, best wishes, Richard J. Daley. I mean, he just loved kind of the sort of detail.
Did he go to college?
He worked really hard. He went to parochial schools, and he went through DePaul law school at night, and he, passed the bar and was a lawyer.
Was he a member of the city council or the county? Was it? Yeah.
Right. No, he wasn't.
How many members were there?
There are 50. The city's divided into 50 different wards.
And how many of those voted with him when he was mayor?
Most
maybe better
of the time,
is how many didn't vote with him.
One or two.
Of all the 50? Mm-hmm. The entire time he was mayor?
Most of the time. There was a few times when there were a few more independents and a few more, but in the later years, maybe 6 max.
What would be, from your research, the main reason that he was able to keep them all? The main reason?
Well, he controlled how they got elected for the first,
How many party people were involved in the whole system of getting people elected in the machine?
Well, there were at least 40,000 patronage jobs, and each precinct,
How many precinct captains?
There were like 1,000 precinct captains. And they were always having these wonderful rallies, and it was a really colorful time. I mean, it's so far removed from today's kind of focus group mentality. And there were these dramatic torchlight parades with candidates. There were big shows of grand activities, and it was a lot of fun.
So if you're a young person and you pick up this book today and you've never heard of this man, and you don't know much about Chicago politics, do you conclude, I mean, does you become more cynical or less cynical based on what you learn?
You definitely become more fascinated by sort of how one person exerted all this power and how he kind of used it to sort of, and he had a vision, and of Bridgeport being sort of replicated throughout Chicago.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Mount Holyoke.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1979.
And what was your course of study?
Studied history and politics. And
then what'd you do? I
did everything wrong. I went and worked here in Washington. I was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I worked on arms control with Leslie Gelb. I had loved Washington. In 1974, I just started writing letters. There were no girls who were congressional pages, and I just finally got my state representative to agree to take me, and I was the first girl congressional page from Pennsylvania. And I continued to work later in the House and then in the Senate, and then went to graduate school at Yale in history. I felt that I just fell in love with history at Mount Holyoke, and I've always wanted to write biography since I was about 7 years old.
Is there another book for you?
Maybe. I'm trying to recover from this one, but C. Van Woodward told me this great story. He said, at Yale, I said, what's the best subject for a biography? And he said, pick a real bitch or a real bastard and make sure they're dead. But I think, and he died, and I think what he meant was that I wouldn't think that they were that at the end.
American Pharaoh is the name of the book. Here's the cover. You can see there Richard J. Daley, mayor until 1976 of Chicago, Adam Cohen and Elizabeth Taylor, co-authors. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Taylor, co-author of American Pharaoh, Mayor Richard Daley, his battle for Chicago and the nation. Where'd you get the title?
Daley was a pharaoh in many senses of the word. He was powerful, he was autocratic, he ruled Chicago for 21 years from 1955 until his death in 1976. And another way, he was also a builder. He built all of the great things with which we associate Chicago. The world's busiest airport, the world's tallest building, Sears Tower, the beautiful, magnificent Mile, the skyline, it's all his. He also built some of the worst buildings in Chicago, some of the public housing projects. And finally, the word pharaoh, it was his nickname from civil rights leaders who had dubbed him that in the 50s and 60s because of his resistance to civil rights, particularly his resistance to Martin Luther King, who actually moved to Chicago and lived there for 8 months.
There's a picture in here, and people who remember the 1968 convention might remember this shot of him at the microphone. What is that?
That is Daley defending his city. Senator Abraham Ribicoff had just said, you know, if we elect McGovern, we will not have the Gestapo tactics in Chicago. He was referring to the extraordinary protests that were occurring on the streets of Chicago, and this was sort of Daley's lowest moment.
Why low?
Daley had campaigned hard. He had wanted the convention brought to Chicago so he could showcase this beautiful city that he had rescued from the brink of despair. And he left no detail untouched. He looked at the convention hall and focused on everything from the ashtrays to the banners. Simply, of course, Mike Royko's Boss, published in 1970. It was very journalistic and kind of gave a great sense of the time. So it was largely anecdotal and just a really fun book to read, and it's a good companion to our book. Another author is really terrific, has contributed to the works on Chicago, is Milton Rakov. I think actually his son is a scholar who's been on your program before. Yeah.
So in 1968, you had the convention, and then when you read about the Chicago 8, David Dellinger and Rennie Davis and all these people, you also see the name Bobby Rush eventually later on after that, where and Bobby Rush is now a congressman.
Right.
How does he fit into all this? Was he a Daley supporter?
No, actually, he ran a terrible race most recently for mayor. He's currently a congressman. He, like many, has sort of softened over time, but is still an opponent of Daley's. The story of the black submachine in Chicago is really fascinating.
And that's, by the way, a phrase you use throughout the book, black submachine.
Right. I mean, Daley operated the machine, and he really depended on sort of loyal black voters, and they really stuck with him over time. And the first one was William Dawson, at one point the sort of most powerful black man in America, only congressman. He really supported Daley and was, in fact, opposed to integration. Kind of ironic because he had fled Georgia because of his family was threatened over a racial incident. But he continued to be a loyal soldier for Daley.
William Dawson.
William Dawson, and he was a very smart guy. We interviewed his nephew and some other relatives of his. We studied his papers at Fisk University. It's a fascinating character. Another character, memory, as a child of Daley.
Richard M. Daley is who? Who is he?
He is Richard J. Daley's eldest son, and like in all good family businesses, he went on to run the family business, and he is now mayor of Chicago.
How long has he been mayor?
He has been mayor since Harold Washington was the first, was elected mayor in 1983, then re-elected in 1987. He died in office, and then Richard M. Daley came in shortly thereafter in '89.
What kind of a mayor has he been compared to his father?
He's very much like his father, but sort of in miniature. Richard J. Daley, operated this huge machine of patronage, 40,000 jobs, and the current mayor is sort of making the widgets in the factory that his father built. They both understand, and this is actually something that Dan Rostenkowski told us in an interview, something that his father had told Richard J. Daley: show people where you're putting their money. Richard J. Daley did that in beautifying Chicago, and Richard M. Daley has done the same. And while Richard J. Daley built big expressways and big buildings, Richard M. Daley is building cul-de-sacs and wrought iron fences. Everything's on a much smaller scale.
And who is the Secretary of Commerce as he relates to the family? That's
William Daley, and he was actually our kind of window into the Daley family. He's widely recognized in Chicago and around the country as a smart guy, and sat down and I interviewed him several times, and he gave us this perspective of the family.
Now, has a book like this ever been done?
No, there's been a wonderful, rich literature on Chicago. The most famous book is, of course, Every Detail. And he was extremely worried about the violence This was in the aftermath of the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. He did not want anything upsetting his city. And the protesters had their sights on Chicago, and he was determined not to let them get any attention. They approached him consistently for all sorts of permits, and he denied them those permits, and this wrangling went on for months. Meanwhile, Daley was sort of, dressing up the city and making it look really beautiful. But finally, in this terrible 20 minutes, everything exploded. The police went wild, attacking protesters, and protesters were also violent. Daley just didn't know what to make of it. Here were these people who nominated Pegasus, this 125-pound pig, for president. They'd threatened to poison the water. They had said that they were going to pull down Hubert Humphrey's pants on stage. These were totally, things that he couldn't deal with. He didn't understand sort of the idealism of the protesters. He kept saying, well, what do they want? What programs do they want? But in the end, Daley was really underestimated, and he came out of it kind of brilliantly.
What part of the country did you grow up in?
I grew up in Swarthmore, a suburb of Philadelphia.
How long have you lived in Chicago?
I was transferred to Chicago by Time magazine. I was a correspondent there, first based in New York. I began in 1983, and then on to Chicago in 1984. And I worked at the magazine until 1996.
Now, Mayor Daley died in '76, as you say, so you never lived under him.
Never. The 1968 convention was really sort of my first Black Submachine, who began as a sort of subservient follower and then became one of the harshest critics, was one of my personal favorites in the book. Was an Olympic star, Ralph Metcalfe, who was a congressman, and he broke with Daley over the issue of police brutality. It took him a while, and actually his son said, hey, Dad, it's, the mayor or me. Two dentists who had been injured by police in traffic violations. They were pulled over, and one, in fact, had a stroke in custody and was then killed. Daley refused to meet Metcalfe in his home district, refused to meet him on the South Side, and Metcalfe was really upset. And Metcalfe eventually just cut it off with Daley. He later said, it's never too late to be black.
Now, on Bobby Rush's case, what I was getting at was the Fred Hampton raid. When did that happen? What was that about?
The Black Panthers in Chicago had really started to kind of get hold in 69 and 70. They had got a very good public relations campaign going. They had free lunch programs, free daycare, and it was they were really trying to kind of make an appeal and kind of position themselves as opponents to Daley. But in this horrible raid, it was ordered by Ed Hanrahan, who was a player in this later. Police went in and just started firing away, killing Hampton and Clark, and it was later learned that there were no arms in that apartment at all. And Daley, that started.
Was that ordered by Mayor Daley?
It was not clear that Daley himself was ordering it, but his people